For our next session, we have really a local powerhouse in talking about settler colonialism and a national one in engaging the issue of Palestine. But I would like to first introduce our moderator for this session, an individual who has been instrumental in really giving an alternative voice or an opportunity for Jews who have opposed the occupation, who oppose Zionism, to really flourish in Southern California. S.T. Chandler grew up in Southern California. Her work in the film industry on both sides of the camera spans more than 20 years. Her resume includes producing and co-hosting the C. Thomas Howell radio show on 97.1 Free FM in Southern California. She is currently a freelance producer working on and developing film and radio projects in Los Angeles. In 2010, she launched a Los Angeles chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a national organization of activists that works to support the aspirations of Palestinians and Israelis for security and self-determination. JVP works with nonviolent peace activists in Israel and Palestine, and in broad coalition with other Jewish, Arab American, faith-based peace and social justice organizations, ST continues to serve as the chapter organizer. Just back from Palestine herself, please help me welcome ST Chandler.
So anybody who's read their program knows that I am simply the lucky girl who gets to introduce our next two amazing speakers. Gabriel Piterberg is a professor of history and the director of the Gustav von Grunbaum Center for Near East Studies at UCLA. He's an ex-Israeli who was born in Buenos Aires and studied at Tel Aviv University and Oxford. Piterberg wrote in 2003, An Ottoman Tragedy, and in 2008, The Returns of Zionism. He writes for New Left Review and London Review of Books. The question that Gabi has been asked to address today is Israel, an unsettled state or a state of settlers? Ali Abumina is the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse, and is a contributor to the Goldstone Report, the legacy of the landmark investigation of the Gaza conflict. He has contributed to several other books, of course, and has written hundreds of articles on the question of Palestine in a wide array of publications, including the Jordan Times, the New York Times, The Guardian, the LA Times, and Al Jazeera. In February of 2001, he co-founded the Electronic Intifada, a pioneering online resource for media analysis, criticism, and activism. And Ali has been asked to speak about realities on the ground, solutions considering Israel's settler-colonial nation. So without taking any more time, I am going to get out of the way and let you guys enjoy what is going to be a fantastic conversation between these two intellectual powerhouses, Gabriel Piterberg and Ali Abumina.
Masa al-khair. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm honored to share a panel with Esti and Ali. I think this is a very important event, and there should be many like it, and I'm very pleased to have been invited and to be able to speak. What I thought I could do is give some historical depth to the question of Palestine and explain what this increasingly acceptable paradigm for understanding the history of Israel-Palestine, which is the paradigm of comparative settler colonialism. And I want to start with something current and then go back and explain what this is and put it in context. And the current thing that is going on within Israel-Palestine is the Praver Plan. The Praver Plan, which gave rise to very heated demonstrations by mostly Israeli-Palestinian citizens, but also Jews who support them and Palestinians in the occupied territories, is one more, but quite ambitious, stage in the dispossession, collective dispossession of not only the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but the Israeli Palestinians who are the citizens of the Israeli state within the Green Line, to the extent that it's still a meaningful borderline. And without going in details into the program, which was constructed by Joshua Praver, a very famous Israeli geographer, is meant to concentrate the Bedouins in the south, in the Negev area, and then turn to the Galilee, which had already been or has been a target of the same policy under Judaization of the Galilee since the 1970s, concentrate them in certain areas which will become shanty towns, just like the ones that already exist, and enable the state to put its hands on the lands from which they will be evacuated and settle Jews on it. In the sense, it's the familiar story we know from the occupied territories, but this is happening within the state itself and is being done to its own citizens. So we are not talking about, not that it's much better to do it to the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but it is another, at least legal degree, because it is being done to citizens of the state. Now, what is this? What is the context of this seemingly strange state project in which it declares that it wants to Judaize, in other words, give the land which it controls to a certain portion of its citizens, who are the majority, there's no question about that, and cleanse, basically, the others who are not Jewish, take over their lands and settle the majority of the ethnic group of the state, after whom the state is, on whose identity, of course, the state is based, and settle them there. Now, this seemingly strange policy, which is obviously unjust, is racist, and is unacceptable to anyone who understands the modern state as something more or less objective that is supposed to work for the benefit of all its citizens, regardless of who they are in terms of gender, religion, ethnicity, and so on. It is simply called settler colonialism. And now, now that we have this current event going on, I want to give you a brief, very brief background of what this is, because in a way this explains best what the hell is going on in this part of the world. Now, I need to clarify that when I'm saying that Israel, I mean, the answer to the question posed is very simple. Israel is a settler colonial state. The Zionist is a settler colonial movement. Now, it is important to understand that when I'm using this term and going back in time and explaining what it is, I am not talking exclusively or only or even mainly about the settlers in the occupied territories. I'm talking about the whole project. This should be clear. So because the settlers in the occupied territories are called settlers, but the people who will be living in new communities established now on evacuated Bedouin lands, if this program is realized, and I hope it does not, or it is not, they will not be called settlers, but I am referring to all of them in that sense as a settler project, okay? So it's not exclusively the settlers, the Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. Now, without elaborating too much in terms of the history of this notion, what perhaps is essential to understand is that since the 16th century, since the expansion of Europe, explosion of Europe really, outside of its own continental boundaries into the rest of the world, including where we are now, two forms of colonialism developed. One is called metropole colonialism, in which territories were conquered by a European state, and the purpose was to exploit its resources, its local native labor, and to use it as a strategic asset for competition with other European states. And these areas were ruled mostly by a colonial administration and army. British India is the obvious example. But there was another, in my view, more insidious and much more eliminatory or genocidal type of colonialism, which is usually not associated with colonialism, which is called settler colonialism. And in that colonialism, some of the areas that had been conquered by these European states brought with them waves of immigrants who began to settle in these areas, and with time saw in them the future territory in which they would establish their national patrimony. These areas are what is now the United States, Canada, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, previously Rhodesia, and Palestine, Israel. What is unique, perhaps, about Palestine, Israel is that it's relatively late. It happened relatively late on a territory conquered, again, by a European colonial empire. Now, unlike the colonials of the metropole colonialism, who come to exploit, who come to use the territory's resources for their own benefit, but eventually, as we know from history, have to leave, the settlers come to stay. And therefore, there's one idiom I want you to remember from a very famous scholar and wonderful one of settler colonialism, an Australian scholar by the name of Patrick Wolfe. In that sense, in the sense of settler colonialism, invasion is a structure, not an event. In other words, it continues to work constantly. It does not stop with the settlers dispossessing the natives, taking over their land, and establishing their own state. They continue to function as settler states even after they had become sovereign states. Now, what is unique, or what is crucial, not unique, I shouldn't say unique, crucial for this type of settlement, which is true for early Zionist settlement, which began in the 1880s, but with crucial transformation in the 1900s. The north of the United States, say in the 17th century, what would become Virginia and New England, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Canada. These are the main, this is the main group of cases that is relevant for us here, is that this is crucial, although it's very scholarly, but it's also very real. They want the native land. They do not want, I emphasize again, they do not want the native labor. This is crucial. Now, in this structure, if you look at it for a moment from a settler perspective, within settler logic, the natives become superfluous. Why? Because the labor is not needed. So all these attempts to say, wrongly I think by critics, by people who share our politics, that Israel is colonial in a very vague and abstract sense without explaining exactly in what sense, are wrong, because then the Israeli propagandists and Zionist propagandists answer back, but we've never exploited Palestinian labor, which they haven't for the most part. But that's precisely the point. That's why it is settler colonialism, because it wants the land, not the labor. And that's why the metropole colonials are so dependent in a way, although they're oppressive, but they're so dependent on natives, because without their labor, they can't exist. Settler colonialism not only can, it wants to exist with white labor only. That's why the Indians became expendable, that's why the Aboriginals became expendable, and that is why the Palestinians are expendable from a Zionist Israeli perspective. In other words, if I had to tell you what is it that has bothered for now more than 100 years, the Israelis, first the Zionists, now the Israelis, about the Palestinians, what is it that bothers them? It's not their so-called terrorism. It's not their difference in culture. It's none of those. It's their mere presence. That's what bothers them. And that's why I think what is happening in Palestine-Israel is simply the continuation of the attempt to get rid of the natives because they are not needed. If you take, in a cold calculation, if you take all the Palestinians out of Palestine and Israel today, the Israeli economy can function. It doesn't need them. I'm not saying that against the Palestinians. I'm saying this in order to explain to you what is structurally happening. Now, I want to jump, now that we've understood the basic parameters of this, and I think it's important to understand, and I cannot repeat it enough, it is not colonialism in some vague sense, it is settler colonialism, which wants the land, doesn't want the labor. The material foundation of this is absolutely crucial because we get stuck in cultural explanations, racism, depictions of the other, and so on and so forth, which is all important. But if we don't understand the economic, socio-economic, material foundation, I think we don't understand anything. Now, what the Zionist Israelis have been doing ever since is precisely this thing, to create from the 1900s, between 1904 and 1914, if you want the crucial period, they've been trying to create their own labor and get possession of as much land as possible. That is, in a way, the whole story. Now, all these attempts, from the early settlements, which were done under the British mandatory state, to the post-48 era, I'll talk about the Nakba in a second, to the Judaization of the Galilee in the 70s, to the proper plan now, is precisely this. It's an attempt to deny and nullify, not only in theory, but also in practice, any collective Palestinian or non-Jewish, for that matter, the Bedouins, ownership and access to land, and the transfer of that land into Jewish hands, mostly through the state and the Jewish National Fund, which is an arm of the state, basically, and had pre-existed the state, and to some extent also through private ownership. Now, what happens in settler states after the frontier stage? The frontier stage is the initial stage, which is the most violent. And in it, if the settlers win, they, in many cases, although thankfully not in Palestine, Israel, they basically commit genocide. That's what happened here, in North America. That's what happened in Australia. To a lesser extent in New Zealand, but there's no shortage there either. And that, in a sense, if you will, the culmination of this is the 48 war and the Nakba. This was not a genocide, not because one is better than the other, but because they couldn't, if you want, finish it in the circumstances of that period. But after that, that's why this settler invasion is a structure, not an event. It continued. And you have the land laws of the 1950s, which enabled the state to loot whatever Palestinian land was left within the now state of Israel, and so on and so forth. Now, what happened in '67 is that the settler project, believe it or not, became punctured, impeded, because the next stage of the settler project is to integrate whatever natives remain, and usually these are small numbers, by assimilating them, by making them equal citizens. Now, by making them equal or as equal as possible citizens, this seems very nice, and perhaps it is on the whole good, but that fragments and depoliticizes the natives, and they lose any identity as a collective, and therefore any historical claim to the land and to self-determination. Now, this was happening in Israel, because once the military government of the Israeli Palestinians, which lasted from 1949 to 1966, was abolished, this could have been achieved. The numbers were relatively small. They could have been made increasingly, that was the intention, to liberalize. Liberalism is not in contradiction to settlerism. So this was removed, was lifted, and a process whereby the Palestinians in Israel would have become more equal citizens, private citizens, would have also eliminated their collective claims and their collective identity or their collective fabric. But then came the 1967 war, which completely reversed the process. And it reversed the process because of the addition of so many Palestinians, so many new territories. And what Israel became, paradoxically almost, is a state which is a settler state, but it also has colonies, which are not part of its sovereignty, at least not formally, not officially. And that process and that conquest, which actually, which was celebrated as a big victory, was actually, if you will, if I'm not using too big a word, dialectically, actually obstructed the completion of the settler project through laws, or what we call lawfare, like warfare, but warfare through laws, and the privatization and depoliticization of the natives. Because so many were added, because they started creating colonies against, I think, their better interest in these occupied territories. And now we stand in a situation in which there's a settler state that internally is acting as a settler state, but externally has colonies that it doesn't know what to do with. And it's confusing because we are used to colonies that are overseas, like the British had and the French had, and this smallness of Palestine and the fact that the colonies are 10 minutes away from the actual mother state or colonial state makes it difficult to see, but that's really what it is. And by their 67 conquest, they actually lost the opportunity, in my view, to complete the settler project. In other words, say, imagine there had not been a 67 war. What Israel would have done internally, and that's why the Praver plan was such a convenient point to begin my talk from, or my quick presentation, is that it would have completely assimilated the Palestinians, just like the Native Americans are being integrated into this society, with problems, of course. It's not nice or ideal, or the Aboriginals are being assimilated into Australian society. In the circumstance of settler colonialism, assimilation is simply the final stage of elimination, because it eliminates the natives as a group with claims to sovereignty, to land title, to culture, and so on. The last thing I want to say in this sort of fragmented talk, and we'll obviously have more time in discussion, is that I am a supporter of what I call the common state. It used to be called, or it is called commonly, the one state, which is ideally neither Jewish nor Arab, in Western Palestine, and in a way it puts an end to the settler project. But in another way it does not. And I am not saying this to oppose the idea of a common state, but to make us also think about it, because if there ever is a common state, it might be also the end of Palestinian claims to sovereignty and self-determination. In other words, they would have to fuse with the settlers. And there is a sense in which, since the settlers are still the more powerful part of this equation and will remain so for a long time, whether we like it or not, this is a fact that we have to face, the result of a common state might be that in a way, the settler project will come, in a way, to a successful end. It will come to a successful end because it will remain the more powerful state, or the more powerful group, and it will bring the Palestinians to relinquish their demand, their historical demand, for land ownership and self-determination. So what I want to emphasize by this is that underneath the slogans of 2 states, 1 state, common state, there are actually serious questions that need to be discussed. Finally, I can't, and there I'll end, it's impossible not to say a word about Mandela and his death. And the way I would mention him is to make the comparison in 1 sentence between South Africa and Israel, because this is being used, the Apartheid Week, and this is an apartheid state, and the apartheid notion is being mobilized for activists, and which is good, it's a good mobilizing term, but it is also inaccurate or not completely accurate. There are similarities, there are differences, and the differences make Israel-Palestine, in my view, even a worse case. Why? Because, again, I go back to where I started from, the material formation. In the South African formation, which is a settler state, but of a different kind, unlike the North of America or Australia or Canada or Australia or New Zealand or Israel-Palestine, in South Africa, the natives were crucial to the economic structure. It could not have functioned without their labor. And therefore, at any stage of this horrible apartheid, at no stage was it ever contemplated that the South African blacks would be cleansed. Not because the Afrikaners were nicer than the Zionists, but because the economy wouldn't function without them. So the fact that until today, in my view, from a Zionist, again, perspective, the Palestinians are superfluous to the land-labor formation makes that case harder and in a way more dangerous than South Africa ever was. Thank you.